Football is one of the most ultimate collision sports of all time. But do you know for the first 100 years of college football, the NCAA almost laughed at safety. In fact, they told people they were fools if they didn't wear shoulder pads, but didn't enforce the rule until the 1970s. We have more in this story from our guest tonight. Now, Timothy P. Brown of Football Archaeology joins us today to talk about safety equipment from antiquity. Tim, welcome back to the Pigpen.
Hey, Darren. Um, I just want to say that you always make me feel safe. So,
I do.
and I appreciate that. Yeah,
Maybe that's
you're,
because when you talk to me, you're hundreds of miles away and you're only looking at it through a glass
we're
box.
in the same time zone, but that's about as close as we get.
Yeah, we got like a lake in between us, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, Tim, you recently wrote an article titled Head, Shoulders, Knees, and Toes Football Equipment Safety Standards. And what can you tell us about this story?
Yeah. I just, it's one of those things just was thinking about at one point, and it was, you know, the the first football rules in America, were developed in 1876, and they had a rule that basically said, you can't um, you couldn't have wear equipment, and they were primarily talking about the shoes, but you couldn't wear equipment that had iron or gutta percha. And you'll see gutta percha in a lot of the early rule books, and it's like a pseudo plastic that came from some kind of Indonesian tree sap. Um, and like early golf balls were all made with gutta percha. So, golfers who are into the history of the sport may have come across that same term. But so, it's kind of a tougher material. But the whole thing was, they banned certain materials to ensure the safety of the other players. And and then that was kind of that's kind of the way it remained. They didn't really have any other equipment rules per se. And then in 1900, they added a rule that that barred sticky and slippery substances. So again, those were not so much about the player safety, but it was still they were initially the rules were around banning certain substances in the equipment. And then everything kind of switched. So starting in 24, they had a rule that was no sharp cleats, right? And back then the cleats were still leather. They weren't metal or plastic or rubber or anything. They were leather. Uh, I can't
Nubs,
think of it. I'm sorry.
like leather nubs sewed on the bottom.
Yeah, they tend to be kind of triangular.
Okay.
Um, Sometimes they'd be like rows, but kind of triangular in shape. Anyways, you'd need a cobbler to tack them on and all kinds of stuff. But so that was the first rule that was really, kind of that was a safety rule, but it was still protecting another player, right? Because you weren't going to spike yourself, you were going to spike somebody else. Um, but then that same year they also said, okay, any equipment that you wear that is of a harder substance has to be padded on the exterior. So shoulder pads were, initially shoulder pads were literally just, soft pads sewn on the outside of the shoulders, but then they turned in, they became something you wore inside. And by the mid 20s, they were getting harder, it's different fibers and sole leather and stuff like that. So it became an issue. We got to protect players from the equipment, others are starting to wear. But that was the first rule that really did that. Then in 32, they added you had to wear soft knee pads. You and that was not to protect the player's knees; it was to protect the head of somebody tackling a player. And so they wanted if they're going to get hit, if you're going to get kneed in the head, they want the knee to be cushioned by some kind of felt or rubber sort of concoction. Um, Then, in the 30s into 40s, then they said, okay, you got to wear a head covering or helmet, right? High schools did in 35, colleges in 39, the NFL in 43. So now, okay, now you got to protect the player's head. Um, in 57, the NFL required face masks. NCAA didn't require them, oddly enough, until 1993, but that's kind of a whole other story. Mouth guards, uh, 60, high schools in 62, colleges in 72. Uh, the NCAA finally required shoulder pads in 74. And then in 78, you had the NOC certified helmets. So it's just one of those interesting things where, so you didn't have to wear a helmet at all. And then, say 1930s, okay, now you got to wear a helmet, but you didn't have to wear a face mask. And then finally, then you started having to wear a face mask, and then you had to wear a helmet that was tested to meet a certain quality standard. And those were, even the ones in like 70, 78 probably were kind of almost barbaric compared to what they are
Mhm.
now. But, so it's just kind of funny, that we had this equipment, we went from leather helmets to the plastic and like suspension and then padded interiors and stuff like that. But it wasn't until 78 there was any kind of testing or any way to check the quality or to confirm the quality of the helmet. So, we went from having like there were lots of lawsuits at the time too. So we went from having like 22 helmet manufacturers in the US to 3. So and within just a handful of years. Now we've had a couple of others come into the market, but that's pretty recent. So it kind of explains why Rydell dominated the market, for so long.
Yeah,
No.
it's really kind of interesting when you sit there and you talk about the knee pads and the pads below the belt. Uh, Now most players at the upper levels don't wear them at all. I mean, I hope to God they wear something underneath to protect the jewels, but you don't see
Yeah.
the thigh pads and knee pads and even hip and tailbone protectors anymore. They're just wearing spandex, it seems like.
Yeah. It's a funny thing. Like um, I think about like, high school and even, college, the fields we practiced on were not particularly nice. I mean,
No.
depends on which area of the field you're on, but, a lot of them were just dry dirt and, mud and, whatever. Uh, so the leg protection was probably a bigger deal, but now, these guys are playing on, beautiful, the artificial turf is so much softer than it, back in when it first was introduced. And even, like the worst grass fields are so much better than what was available in the past. Now, again, practice fields prior come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes and colors and whatnot. But you know, I don't know that it's needed as much as it once was. Right. So, and I mean, they track injury statistics pretty darn close. So they've got a good idea of what really is needed from a safety standpoint. And so I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe as a referee, you saw some things a little differently, but
Well, I mean, that was before like the big, helmet evolution that's gone over the last 10 years or so. Now, these companies, and you even see the NFL players. I think you see some of these veterans like Aaron Rodgers this year, switching to the Steelers. His helmet that he's wore his whole career is no longer, it's obsolete. It's no longer allowed
yeah,
on the NFL field. So he had to try to figure out a different style helmet, different brands, and they have 3 or 4 different brands they can use and different
yeah,
styles. But it's amazing what technology is doing, and they still have a long way to go because there's still people getting head injuries and getting maimed and even deaths. We still read about in the paper. So we applaud the science doing it, but still a long way to go.
yeah. So, but again, looking all the way back, it was initially, there just wasn't a lot of thought to protecting yourself, right? It was about protecting other players. And, then eventually, then it became much, the rules have been, shifted to really be a combination. It's for each individual player's protection, but also, um, to protect others. And I think a lot of probably the plastic helmet drove a lot of that kind of stuff. The need to just the plastic helmet was a weapon, but especially the way they taught certain tackling and blocking at the time. But there were ways to kind of protect against it too. So I think a lot of the rule changes, spearing and all that kind of stuff is dramatically. That's probably had as much an impact. on preventing deaths as almost the equipment itself. I mean, there were the number of people who used to come flying in with their head down,
Right.
you know, just asking for an injury, you know.
Yeah, it's really came to light, especially these recent years, like the Ryan Shazier injury and some other, famous NFL and college players that, Daryl Stingley and some of
Yeah,
those, that were tragic. And it's mainly because players weren't, looking at what they're hitting. That's what the big
yeah,
motto of
right.
coaches today. And, a whole different world than it was 25 years ago and before in
Yeah.
the world of football.
Well, and back in the day, you had a lot of, new players, kids who hadn't played before. And, maybe they didn't have the best coaching in the world either. But, they dropped their head, when
Mhm.
coming in on a tackle or in blocking. And so, yeah, anyways, thankfully that kind of stuff is, by and large outlawed. And, while we can all argue about um, specific targeting calls that you think aren't fair or, that it's a silly rule. I mean, to me, I'm all for it. And if a couple kids get kicked out of the game here and there, well, too bad, given the larger issue.
Yeah, I love the way it's being officiated using technology too, like the college game does.
Yeah.
That's really makes it a much better game and really puts people on alert. Hey, keep your head up. Don't take cheap shots. Let's play a game of football. Let's play fair, and everybody can keep playing. That's the way
Yeah.
to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, really, really interesting point you make up, going through that whole history of, basically the football equipment you just went through with us. And you do a lot of this where you will talk about the modern game and take us in the Wayback Machine to tell us how do we get from there to here. And you do this in your tidbits and some other things. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how we can enjoy some of those.
Yeah. The main thing is just go to footballarchaeology.com and subscribe. And if you do, you'll get an email every time that I publish a new story. You got some other options you can follow, or you can just follow me on Blue Sky, or just bookmark the site and, come and show up anytime you want. But anyways, that's basically just go to footballarchaeology.com or go to Amazon or other retailers and, look up my name if you're looking for a book.
All right, Tim. Well, we sure appreciate you coming on here each Tuesday and sharing some of this great football, ancient remedies and equipment things and
Yeah.
rules changes. And love to talk to you again next week.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Darren.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.